Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. 6 Weeks, 6 Issues is our weekly talk series where we are exploring the big issues we're facing as COVID-19 changes the world around us. And we're bringing you the top policy experts and decision makers who are directly involved in thinking through and planning Victoria's recovery to answer your questions. And today we're looking at the future of schools, and we'll aim to get through as many questions as possible. Some of you have already submitted questions online, but you can also submit questions during this event through Slido, and you can vote for the questions that you like, and that helps me with moderation. I'd like to introduce now our guest speakers. Steve Cook is the Foundation Principal of Albert Park College. He has led the development of 2 inner city secondary schools in Melbourne, and in 2017, Steve was awarded the Victorian Education Excellence Award for Outstanding Secondary Principal and the Lindsay Thompson Award for Excellence in Education. Hayley McQuire is a proud Darinbal and South Sea Islander woman from regional Australia. She is the co-founder and national coordinator of the National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, Australia's first Indigenous youth-led organisation solely committed to education. Her writings on social justice and equitable education have been published in The Guardian and New Matilda, and Hayley has worked with national education coalitions in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. And Katherine Whetton is the Deputy Secretary, Policy, Strategy and Performance in the Department of Education and Training. Prior to that, Katherine worked at the Department of Premier and Cabinet for more than 10 years, and most recently as Executive Director, Economic Strategy and Director, Health and Human Services. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Steve, I'll start with you. You're at the front line of this extraordinary period of time in our education system. How do you think this is likely to change the way we teach and the way our children learn?
That's a big question to open up with, but look, I think this is something to really celebrate. This is an extraordinary achievement that roughly over 4 days, we've moved our entire learning online, and this transition has been so dramatic and so immediate, and that we need to acknowledge that. I think what it's done, I think, is really put front and center the importance of using technology to promote education or to facilitate education. This is absolutely front and center of the work that we'll continue to do in the future, I believe.
Hayley, what are your thoughts? What are the key lessons from your perspective?
Well, I think if anything, it's, I guess, turned education a little bit on its head in terms of we're so used to thinking about our learning experiences as in these classrooms surrounded by brick and mortar with the school bell ringing. You know, there's still those symbols of how the education system came out of that industrial area that I think with moving to online has changed. Students have more autonomy over their learning experience in a way. But I think it's also important to, center that there is equity issues in this approach, and that when we do rebuild or build back stronger, that we have to really keep that front and center in our minds.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. Can you expand on that? There are benefits, but it's not a level playing field, is it?
No. Well, I think, and obviously the 2 panelists will definitely have experience in this, but when we were talking with young mob around, especially young people that chose to return back to their homes from boarding school, or just seeing the different ways that some public schools were able to transition online versus private schools who were able to transition online a lot faster. It just kind of shows the different levels of resourcing that are available to different schools and communities in Australia, and that perhaps it's not, when we think about, I think what this global pandemic showed was that we are living in that hyper-connected, globalized society that we always spout on about, but sometimes it feels like a little bit hard to connect to what that means in our lived reality. Well, now we've lived it quite intimately. And so what does that mean then in terms of how we prepare for the future, knowing that these kinds of pandemics or these kinds of global issues can directly impact us and directly impact us in our daily lives, and that technology is incredible, but if you have communities that don't have access to the NBN, or if families can't afford home internet, or if you're living in a home where you only got 1 or 2 computers and everyone needs to be working online, parents and kids, you know, what does that mean in terms of how we create those flexible learning options?
Katherine, those issues must have been front and centre as you were thinking through, you know, the incredible logistics of managing a school year that looks like no other.
Thanks, Kate. It's true that Steve says we had about 4 days to move everything, our whole schooling system, to online in sort of remote and flexible learning. So I think that principals and teachers, students, and let's definitely not forget parents, have done just such an incredible job this year at being incredibly patient and flexible in being able to move to that environment. And I think for all of the individual stories, I just hear so many of, you know, either something went disastrously badly or went brilliantly well, sort of individual stories. But as a whole, I don't think we ever could have thought it would be perfect, and it certainly hasn't been. I suppose part of the challenge too has just been the chopping and changing. So it's not even like we've had one transition and then one transition back. We've actually gone through quite a few stages already, just even over the past several months. And thinking about, I think this has accelerated though some of the thinking we might have been doing around the edges. And oh, we've got a visitor. So some of the thinking that we've been doing that some schools do this brilliantly well, to engaging with their families, that parent engagement in their children's learning has probably never been as strong as it is right now. And we see in primary school, parents do engage really well with their children's learning, but it starts to drop off as that goes through secondary school. So I think that's something that we should really, really try and capitalise on, in just that involvement in learning.
I think it's a really great point, and I'm a parent with 2 children at home, and I have learnt more about my, you know, the learning preferences of my 14-year-old versus my 17-year-old. I would never have had that visibility before. Steve, and it's been fantastic, but Steve, how do we what do we take from that, and how do we hold on to those sorts of things into the future?
That's a good question. I have to say, I have a lot of sympathy for families that are sort of wrestling over who gets the bulk of the internet usage in their household. You know, that idea that everyone is working remotely from home as a family. What do we hold? And can I just, before I answer that, just talk briefly about the issue Hayley raised, and that is as people were transitioning to remote learning, I agree there can be some unevenness between schools. In our case, for example, every single student has a device, and so that makes that transition simpler than schools that perhaps don't have that model. But I was really impressed by the way the government supported that transition through the use of genuinely providing internet access and devices. And I think, as Hayley indicated, you need the tools to work effectively remotely. And I think that's one thing, getting back to your point, one thing that we've really learned, that unless you have the tools to work effectively from home or from school, then we can't easily or seamlessly make that transition. And I think all schools did that very effectively with the support that we got. So I think that's a big lesson for the future, maybe a big question. Do we if we're going to embrace the use of technology, then everyone has to be able to move seamlessly, whether in a remote location or school location, with the equipment that you need, the tools that you need, which is fast, reliable internet and also a device that can do the work. I think the other element too to think about is that for our students, they are digital natives. I don't think, generally speaking, they've found the move to working online as tricky as perhaps some of us have. You know, it's in their DNA. It's what they do. It's the world they're used to. I think the statistic around students with mobile devices, around 98% of students have 1 to 3 devices in their lives. You know, so I think that aspect's fine. The challenge, I think, has been more around fast and affordable internet access. I think and as a system, are we going to put technology in the centre? Is this something that's not an option anymore? You must have a device. You must have good internet access to really maximise as we move into robotics and nanotechnology and so on. Are we going to maximise and take what we can from this world? And if we want to do so, we need to make sure everyone's got the capacity to engage in that world.
Well, Hayley, that flows very much to the work that you've been doing for quite some time, doesn't it? You know, equitable access to both technology and internet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like digital access is one piece of the equity puzzle, and with the work of the Indigenous Youth Coalition, it's also talking about, we've been doing a lot of talking about, well, what would the future of learning look like from an Indigenous perspective if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty was actually centered in that whole learning design. And I think it's also around like the culture that you embed in education. Like that's all about access and equity as well, I believe. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting point.
Katherine, just thinking through that, give us an insight into now some of the thinking that's going into planning for the future and the shift that this has had on your strategic planning as a department.
So just picking up on the device issue to start with, that the department does play a role in supporting schools with devices, but this has not been something that we've done at this scale before, and it's something like 48,000 devices and dongles and laptops that we've distributed as a department, some that we already had in stock and some that we've had to then purchase. And even during COVID, it's been pretty hard to even get some of those devices. So trying to get as many out to those families who need them as possible. And that is a sort of interesting question for us too, about the role of the education system in providing those sorts of devices. But as you say, if we can't level up the playing field, it's really, really challenging to see how you can get those then equitable outcomes for students. So we are thinking a lot about how the role of the department in providing that kind of access, but also, as Steve's talked about too, think that this period has also really accelerated our use of technology in learning. And so I think there are a whole lot of teachers who've had some very accelerated professional development over the past few months in the use of digital resources and learning for their students. And I've heard lots and lots of stories of the second time that we've gone into remote and flexible learning that schools have been able to, they've just learnt so much already about how to do it better, and that there's some real improvements in this second round about how to do it, and teachers feeling more comfortable to use some of those digital platforms and those resources. So I think it's something that as a department, as I said before, it's been work that we've been doing, but it feels like this has really pushing us into a much more coherent picture about how we use digital tools and resources to support student learning.
Look, it's a terrific point, and Steve, you talked before about most of our students being digital natives, and perhaps the learning curve not being as steep for students as it has been for parents and teachers. Tell us about how teachers are coping.
Well, certainly in our context, I've been really incredibly proud of how our teachers have been coping. I mean, I think teachers always have students at the centre. You know, that's why they do their profession. It's what they care about. And I think they've been working really hard to maintain that connection and to make the transition. We're in a fortunate place because for 10 years now, we've had a guaranteed online curriculum. And I think that's a really important message, that at a school level, that we need to make sure that if we're using technology to learn, that curriculum is available online and ready to use. But I think for our teachers, one of the challenges has been in moving to an online world. It's just been to not try to replicate 100% the work that you can do in the classroom, and giving teachers permission to let some things go and to focus on what's really critical and important. And I guess the same is true for parents out there as well. You know, just that we are in a pandemic, and everyone is working extraordinarily hard to do their best. And so a little bit of letting go and a little bit of just focusing on the core business of teaching and learning is probably a key message. Teachers, I think, have done an extraordinary job. In fact, I think one of the great things out of, not a great thing, but a positive thing that's come out of the COVID crisis is, I think, a new respect for the work that they do. And you know, it's interesting when you're beaming yourself live into someone's lounge room, how that relationship can change. And I think we're seeing some real opportunities here, whether it's doing live parent-teacher interviews. You know, you've got the mum and the parents at home with their kids sitting beside them, the teacher directly having this conversation in the household, or as we do with Google Meets, where you're directly working and tutoring and working with kids in their home. I think that reaching out aspect and that interactive aspect's been really, really powerful. But for teachers, I think it's been an extraordinary time of professional learning, professional development. And in a way, we've fast-tracked perhaps 5 to 10 years of professional learning into a short period. And I think we should just take a step back and congratulate them for the work that they're doing.
Absolutely. Hayley, you're nodding. You would agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think especially what Stephen said about the importance and the role of educators. I think I'm in a similar position where my daughter is home with me 24/7 now. And I think parents have been given an insight in the fact that schools are not a place where you just send your kid off to and you kind of like dust your hands. That teachers are actually playing a critical role in the lives of their children, in just giving them the tools that they need to then go on to what they want to do in the world. And I think it's really focused again, like what the purpose of education and learning is, both as an individual but as a society. You know, there's a value that, you know, these are the next generations of doctors, lawyers, leaders that are in the classroom every day. And so how do we nurture and really respect the people that are playing roles in that nurturing journey? I think, yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic point. And look, a reminder to our audience that you can submit questions. We'll come to your questions in a moment. I just want to ask one more question, Katherine, of you, just in relation to VCE. I'm sure that this has been sort of front and centre for the thinking and planning of the department. But is it also an opportunity to rethink? We've talked for years and years. There's been debates about the best way to assess, performance. Is this an opportunity to rethink that?
Well, I think we're in a year where if we don't take lessons out of how we might rethink things, then I don't know when we ever will. So yeah, look, it's been a really big focus of the whole system, and thinking about, I know Steve, the work that he's doing and his teachers and the department and the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority about how really try and support these students through their final year of schooling. It's just been such a stressful year for them. And look, there've been some changes that have been made this year to help those students get through with a really disrupted year. And so things like the GAT has been moved, exams have been pushed back a little bit further into the year. Some of the requirements for assessment have been sort of tailored and reduced to try and help with that disruption. But there's quite a lot of thinking about what does the best senior secondary or secondary schooling look like for a world that is different to it was when, you know, we sort of think 2025, how many years ago, and has the model really changed? And there's some work, there's Peter Shergold recently released a report about senior secondary pathways, and he's got some really interesting recommendations there. There's also a review being undertaken in Victoria by John Firth that's also looking about how we're really trying to think much more about setting our young people up for future success in their lives and careers as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of trying to get this cohort through and support them as best as possible, as well as thinking about what we can do better in the future.
Look, we might go to questions from the audience now. The first one perhaps is one for you, Steve. If schools change their practices after remote learning, what are the implications for the recruitment and retention of highly qualified, skilled and passionate teachers? Do you think that there will be a shift in terms of the criteria and the kind of skills that we're looking for in the teaching profession?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think absolutely. I mean, we've always looked for people who are passionate about and embrace the use of technology. It's like one of the really fundamental questions that we ask when we recruit our staff. So I think that is a given, is it not? I mean, it's true of every other profession now, isn't it? I mean, you can't imagine work. Just try for a day turning a device off and see how strange that feels. So I think that the same is true in our profession, that we'll be looking for people that are really nimble, really agile, really adept at using technology and in really creative ways. Because I think one of the challenges of this second round is, I mean, the first round, we're just trying to get it right. We're trying to get good, solid teaching and learning occurring. I think one of the challenges with the second and longer lockdown has been about engagement and how do we excite students about remote learning, that next level. So how do you do things that are truly transformative and creative and original? And they're the sort of qualities I think that we'll be looking for with the next group of graduates coming through, you know, as they enter the profession. You certainly couldn't imagine having a teacher in your midst who doesn't have that in the center of their as a core capability. Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think it will shape the sort of teachers, the sort of training we do, and also the sort of qualities we look for in our teachers. Perhaps you know, one fundamental change is this whole move into video conferencing. It's rarely used in education, I would suggest, in the past, and now it's just absolutely mainstream of all the challenges that brings. So the technical capacity, but also how do you maximise that interaction? I think that's another element as well.
Yeah, great points. And look, actually, this sort of feeds in, and Hayley, it's something that you've been looking at in your work. The question is, to strengthen social justice and equity in school education, what policies are needed to cater for individual differences of students and to improve educational standards?
Yeah, that's a really big question as well. Well, I think there's a couple points, and I think there's the work that we've been doing with the Indigenous Youth Coalition, and that is to really understand what the history of our education system is, and then when you deeply understand what that relationship has been, especially with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You know, for our mob, education wasn't always this self-empowering you know, tool to enhance our lives. It was actually a tool of colonization. And, you know, when we think about the stolen generations, children were taken away and put into missions to be re-educated. And so from a social justice standpoint, when we talk with other young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're still feeling in different regards the impacts of that of that legacy in how we experience the education system today. I think in terms of different types of policies, I think what we're doing with Learning Creates Australia is exciting around bringing diverse stakeholders together to discuss what is that learner journey, what does it look like, and what does it look like for different kinds of young people from regional remote areas, from different lived experiences, and how do we then rethink how we define and value success on that learner's journey. So I feel like it's not an answer to say what we should do, but I think it's around that we need to be bringing these conversations together and bringing together those unlikely coalitions of people that center those experiences, those diverse experiences in thinking. Sorry, this is the classic working from home life. Yeah, but to then think about, well, yeah, how do we then design new ways of valuing what success in learning looks like by centering those experiences? Sorry.
And Katherine, that's clearly you were pointing to thinking about that that's happening in the department.
Yeah, I think that there's a focus, I think, through in education about individualized learning. And what I think this period of remote and flexible learning is really, really telling us is just how important that a one-size-fits-all to education is not the answer. And so really thinking about what's going to work for different students who have different circumstances, different backgrounds, different passions and interests. And so how I think it goes to the talent and creativity of our teachers and principals about how they're working with students individually, but then thinking as a system how that there'll be supports that we can put in place that try to really go to what are the best ways of supporting those students in their sort of individual journeys through their education.
And just a reminder to the audience, you can submit your questions through Slido, and you can also vote for questions that you would like to put up. One question here, Steve, for you is, what will schools need to put in place to ensure that those disadvantaged by homeschooling are able to catch up with their peers?
It's an interesting debate about the extent to which people will be disadvantaged by homeschooling. I think there's the example in New Zealand, in southern New Zealand, where following a natural disaster, the research around that indicated, in fact, students weren't particularly disadvantaged. I mean, the idea that remote learning disadvantages you, I think, could be to some extent challenged. I mean, in fact, some kids are thriving in that environment. So I don't think we should assume that people are being disadvantaged. I mean, our model has been simply to be calm, to put this into context, to keep our systems and processes in place and just move them into a remote context so that as far as possible, there's an air of normality and calm and order, and we continue to focus on learning. So we've tried to minimise disadvantage in that way. But where there has been disadvantage, where we have had to address that students who need additional support, for example, we've been able to do that directly into the classroom. So revisiting, for example, the role of integration aid. So they've been able to work directly with students to try and alleviate those concerns. Or to put specialist literacy or numeracy teachers working directly with students remotely. So we've tried to do everything in our power, and I think this is true of schools across the state, to minimise disadvantage and to make sure this is not really. In fact, at times we've taken the opposite view, the alternate view. We said, well, here's an opportunity, here's a chance to do something bold and new, and so we've put our entire library resources online and push this idea, for example, that this is a wonderful opportunity to rediscover and renew a love and a passion for reading. We've run competitions around that. And it's a very organised school-wide attempt to really sort of see how can we be creative in this space and minimise disadvantage. So I feel confident. I feel confident that kids will come through this okay. You know, they're pretty resilient, and I think we shouldn't be too frightened about that. We should think instead that many kids have been able to thrive. We've been able to put good support mechanisms in place for the majority of students, and in some cases, it's even been a chance to enhance their learning. So I guess I look at it slightly differently.
Well, it's interesting actually, because the next question flows off that. Students with a disability, many have benefited from the flexibility of working in a home environment. And Katherine, maybe one for you. The audience member says, will a dual home and school situation be possible where actually there's been great advantage for individual students?
Yeah, it's a great point and a great question. Absolutely. I think that, again, I feel like we've talked quite a lot so far in this conversation about acceleration and fast tracking and things that we might have talked about as a possibility, but maybe and dipped our toe in the water. But now really it's showing us how possible it is. And so the idea of, for those students with disability and all students, in fact, the idea of blended learning models. And so there may be more learning from home. I mean, we've heard stories of some principals who are already doing that. Now, once there was on-site schooling again recently, before we went back into lockdown, that they were doing a morning from home or a day from home, and then bringing students on site for other classes. And so it goes back to the point I was making earlier, just about that really individualized approach, so that not the same thing will work for everyone, but where families and students benefit from a different model. And again, I think that's where, you know, schools are really thinking through what's going to work best for their students, and any sort of support and guidance that we can provide from the department is we're very keen to see those dual approaches.
Hayley, that's something certainly that in your work you've been pushing for.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I think it's also, like, I don't think it's just like you either learn in a classroom or you learn at home. I think what we're interested too is, like, once this pandemic is over, it's also about how we learn in our communities. And so is there a future where, you know, it maybe even talks to, like, well, what's the role of an educator? And do we all have roles as educators and a responsibility to our young people in that respect? And so I'm really interested too, like, what does that journey look like for a 16-year-old? Do they have to spend their entire week in a classroom? Or can they be doing things embedded in their community where there is a scaffolded learning experience for them, but it's different, you know? I think it's also really exciting that, you know, it opens up new possibilities, and that I feel like when I think of the way that I learn about my history and my culture and who I am, that none of that came through a classroom. It came through listening to my aunties, my grandparents, my dad, going out on country, connecting with where I'm from. And, you know, those are just as important, you know, to me. And so I think it creates a bigger conversation around, like, that learning can take place in multiple areas, and how can schools and school leaders play a crucial role in, like, supporting those experiences.
It's a great answer, and a great questions flowed from that. We know that parents and family are the most influential factor in a child's education journey. How do we maintain increased family engagement? Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a very good question too. Look, we've tackled that. We're really very conscious of that, the importance of that relationship between home and school, that it's a partnership of learning, and without parental engagement, parental input, you just simply don't get as good an outcome at the end of the day. So those relationships are so critical. I mean, one of the innovations I think that we've been able to do through this process is that we've introduced a parent portal. And so the idea simply with our positive educational wellbeing curriculum is that conversation you're having at school is one we want to continue at home around the kitchen table. And so being able to provide the families, the parents, if you like, with the curriculum, the very curriculum we're studying at school, and to be able to carry that home and to have that conversation at home is a really powerful way, using technology in a really powerful way to build relationships both at home and at school, and make sure that the conversation that we're having is one that just continues and flows on, you know, in a bigger context, because often teenagers don't carry that conversation home. Let's be frank. So I think there's some real opportunities through technology to build on these relationships that we have between between home and school. So it's a really exciting space. Another thing we've been doing is taking webinars. So we've just had one recently of Michael Carr-Gregg, for example. So we're using that expertise and pushing that out to our parent community. And indeed, this morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m, one targeted for our staff, so that we're looking after their well-being as well. So this connection between home and school is really important, really powerful. And this time just illustrates how much more effective we are if we work together.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, from a parent's point of view, the ease of being able to tap into digital webinars and discussions. It's so much easier than actually having to go to the school. I feel much more engaged actually than I did prior to this. Katherine, this question might be one for you. Currently, teachers with evidence-based practice when planning and assessing learning, how can this be implemented if there's a future emphasis on online learning?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's probably about adapting the way we do assess learning. I think there are a whole lot of tools that already exist, and there's probably us getting much more sophisticated at that. I know there've been a few challenges actually for particularly primary school students and assessment of learning so far, because teachers who make judgments about where their students are at constantly, they're finding it tricky at times to know when has it been the grade 1 student, when is it their work, and when have the parents been so involved in trying to support their child at home that it's really quite hard to know whether, you know, was it the student's work or was it with a great deal of assistance from a family member. So I do think we haven't I don't think we're anywhere near sort of having solved that, but that is something that, again, we're going to have to look at if we are going to move to more online learning.
Just on that, Kate, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I think I recall being fairly engaged in a few assignments of my kids when they were in primary school as well. I think that's probably a time-honoured tradition. But you know, in fact, yesterday I was watching one of my staff working online, you know, in this space, and they're doing a literature sack, for example, and we've pushed it out through Google. You know, I've got everyone online. You can see every student working. You can see their fingers typing across the screen. We've got a plagiarism check running live alongside it. And as a teacher, they can see when you're looking at their particular work, so they can see your image on the screen. So some really robust and really effective ways to manage that at a secondary level. Certainly, I don't speak from the primary level, but there's certainly the tools are already there. It's just about how robustly we want to implement them, and you know, the key is doing it in a way that's, you know, really clear and consistent and fair, and in which, you know, so there's that. There are obviously a lot of work sitting behind this, but already the technology is there to meet that demand. And indeed, many schools are having to do it in that way. Otherwise, we couldn't continue for the kids to learn effectively during this period. So it's about having the systems in place to enable this to occur. The technology is definitely there, and the capacity is there already. Yeah.
There's also the debate, though, too, that in the real world, you know, an open book environment is a far more realistic a situation. So I think it is that, you know, potentially that opportunity to think through how we are equipping our young people to actually enter the workforce.
Yeah, we look at something like formative assessment. We're getting, work in progress. We can push it, back to, this is all online. Push it back to the teacher, and we're tick-tacking back and forth and developing and growing knowledge and capacity. I think this is all there, but these are big projects. It's a big commitment when you look at it on a system-wide basis, but a very, very interesting space, just as the conversation about engaging parents in the life of the school is just really interesting conversations that this is opening up and fast-tracking it, because we can see the capacity now, we can see what's possible. It's a really good time in that sense. Yeah.
I think the other exciting element is, which comes through in one of these questions, is there is not a parent in Victoria, I don't think, who is just, thanks the teachers and has a much greater empathy in relation to the role of teachers. Is this an opportunity, and this comes through in a question, to really foster an enhanced recognition of the professional standing of the teaching sector? And the member of the public who's asking this question says, in Finland, the complexity of teaching expertise is highly valued. Is this an opportunity to really leverage that? Katherine, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. It's a really exciting moment to think about the respect for a great profession. Look, and there are lots of different components to this, and some a little bit more contentious than others, that thinking through about how we remunerate our teachers and how we respect them as a community. But this is another moment to really leverage that perhaps the work of teachers has gone a bit underplayed. And as Hayley said before, that, you sort of send your kids off to school and they come back at the end of the day, but really seeing how teachers are working with students individually, how they're talking with parents about how they're going. We're really keen as well to think about whether, talking again about opportunities, that we're seeing a real spike in interest at universities for people to go into teaching. So it's another thing that we think that we're always looking to support sort of great teaching in classrooms, and whether there are people who are working currently in industries that are really impacted by COVID who would make fantastic teachers. And so we're working with a lot of the universities at the moment about how to try and bring more people whose future currently feels a bit uncertain because of the current sort of social and economic circumstances, to bring more great people into the profession as well.
Hayley, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, well, we know that the teaching profession, I personally think that we should view teachers just as how we view like doctors or paramedics, in that kind of value. I think sometimes, because like being able to define educational success or outcomes is not as discrete as like saving a life, but really this is the essential preparatory work that sets people up for their life trajectory. And so like the role of teachers is really important. And I also think, like that we should be investing in high quality educators, and how do we make sure that teachers be able to like, they have long fulfilling career journeys. I know that some of the pre-service teachers that we talk to that are young people or even new graduates entering the teacher workforce, like burnout is real, and even being a Black teacher in these spaces, the cultural safety that comes along with it is real. And so I think it's also, as much as we want to respect and value the profession, we also have to be real about like what are the demanding pressures on teachers, and how do we create education systems that really support and back teachers long term.
Steve, you're nodding in agreement.
Well, I think there are sort of two things at play here, and I think driven by the pandemic and the use of technology, is that many families had to be more engaged in teaching their kids. So not that families aren't, but even more so. And so an appreciation of the work that teachers do that comes from that. And secondly, they see it's more visible, the work that the teachers are doing, the follow-up and the direct support for their kids and so on. So in my view, that's doing more than anything else ever possibly could to raise the status of teaching. People can see in their homes and in their own life experience the quality of work that's being done by teachers and the difference it makes. You know, at the end of the day, I think teaching, education, one of the few institutions left in our society that people have absolute respect for. And it's such a, you know, it's so important that we nurture educators, we look after them, we support them, because, you know, it's not just the teaching and learning, they're forming, you know, the key beliefs and values of the kids. They're supporting them through their lives. They're teaching them how to be more resilient, how to live their lives better. There's so much work that's done in a school level. And I think that's much more visible now. And that's much more powerful than any advertising campaign, I think. It's just that, it's that lived experience within your community with families and kids and teachers that's been so you know, really positive outcome of this experience. Yeah.
And I think, sorry, if I could add to Stephen too, I think it's also the fact that everyone's had a teacher in their life. And so everyone's familiar with the teaching profession, but often our recollections of that are from the position of a student. You know, you just go through school and then you leave, and you don't perhaps see the enormous structures and pressures that are behind, you know, a teacher in terms of like keeping up with the curriculum and maintaining professional development and school politics and, you know, all of that stuff that is sometimes invisible. I think, you know, people just go into life having whatever kind of coloured view based on their own personal experience. But this has created, like Stephen said, a new window into exactly what it takes.
I think that is a perfect place to end. Thank you so much for joining us. To Steve Cook, to Hayley McQuire and to Katherine Whetton, thank you for your time. Thanks to all our guests, our audience members, for your very thoughtful questions. And we have one more talk in this series. It's on the future of Melbourne, and bookings are now open on the library's website. In the meantime, there's plenty for you to explore online on the library's website and on our social through Library in Your Lounge. So I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Take care and stay safe, and enjoy Library in Your Lounge.